What's up, Warriors, and welcome to another episode of the Mental Health Movement Podcast, Voice for the Voiceless. I'm your host, Chris. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to all of my supporters and friends who have reached out to me this last week. As many of you may know or may not know, I have lost my grandfather, unfortunately. He passed away Saturday morning. And while that brings a lot of sadness and a lot of heartbreak throughout my soul, he lived a good life and arguably one of the wisest and greatest men I've ever known. So, I'm going to dedicate this episode for him because I know he was a supporter of the podcast too. Um, Today's guest, you may know her from the podcast that I was on. She is the host of the Well Anchored podcast. She is a mental health advocate, a writer, and a dance artist. Please help me welcome Belicia Tang. Belicia, how you doing?
Hi, Chris. It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you for coming on. I'm really excited that I'm your first podcast appearance.
Yeah, it's so funny. I've been a podcast host since I think 2022. I had my first podcast, Athlete Voices, where I interviewed competitive athletes, like elite athletes, Olympians, world champions. And then I have my current podcast, The Well Anchored Life, where I interview people amongst us, the unsung heroes of everyday life, who go through challenges and overcome them. And you were a guest on my podcast, and that's how we connected. And funny enough, this is the first time I have ever been invited onto a podcast as a guest. So I'm very excited to inhabit that role. It's
Yeah.
very different than what I'm used to. So I'm excited.
I'm grateful to be in the driver's seat and walk you through your journey here for all our listeners. So very
Yeah.
excited to have you on here. Before the podcast, before just like the mental health field and being diagnosed, how would you diagnose? Jesus, I'm sorry. How would you describe your experience growing up as a triplet and how it shaped your early identity?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I am one of a set of triplets. So I am the middle of a set of triplets. I'm the only girl. So I have two brothers. We're all 27 years old. And the names are Austin, Belicia, and Chris. It's ABC in the order of our birth. My parents purposely did that. And actually we are real life ABCs. We're American born Chinese.
I
I don't
love
think
it.
they intended that, but yeah, no, it was very the way I describe it to people is we're just like any other siblings. We just happen to be the same age and we happen to go through all the life phases, the formative life phases, from age 0 to 18. We went through it at the same time. So growing up as the triplet, it was challenging in some ways because everyone was comparing the three of us
Mm.
to one another. They're always like, "Oh, you are Austin and Chris's sister." I was never just Belicia. I was like one of the Tang triplets, They would always ask us like, "Oh, who are you? Like who's smarter or who has better grades or, you know, so the way I distinguish myself amongst my siblings is I was a competitive gymnast. We distinguish ourselves with our extracurriculars. So I was the gymnast, Chris was the concert pianist, Austin was like the math whiz, so we put a lot of weight into our extracurricular pursuits. So I think I was a gymnast from age 5 to 15. I competed in rhythmic gymnastics, which is the other kind of gymnastics that not a lot of people know. It's the Olympic sport with the ribbons. So we work with hand apparatus, we work with ribbons, hoops, balls, clubs. It's a mixture of like dance, acrobatics, circus arts, acrobatics. I said that already. Object manipulation, contortion, very flexible. That's the kind of gymnastics I did for 10 years.
I love it.
And that was my thing. That was the way I distinguished myself between my brothers. So, my mom was a tiger mom. She was a stereotypical Asian mom. She really emphasized academics and academic performance. She signed us up for tutoring from as far as I can remember. We had a tutor for every subject: math, English, chemistry, physics, Chinese. We all grew up playing instruments. So, piano, we all played piano. I played flute as well. I had a second instrument, and my brothers played violin. That was their second instrument.
Wow.
So all of that, and in addition to school, it was a very intense childhood, I'd say.
Mm.
Intense in that, like, I didn't have the normalcy and balance and play that most children do because I was training at a very high level from age 5, and my dream was to go to the Olympics. That was my dream. And I was training like 25 hours a week, in addition
Wow.
to public school. I was not homeschooled, or I didn't do online school to accommodate my training. I was doing public school, regular school. And my mom was always like, you got to get straight A's. Like that's part of the basics, They had this
Hmm.
set of rules, like the basics, which is like school, music, and for me it was gymnastics. So very intense, we were very competitive as well, amongst one another, like in terms of our grades, it would be like Austin would get an A plus on a math test, and I would get only an A. And I would feel bad about that because I'm like, why couldn't I get an A plus like Austin? I am very type A and competitive as a person. I think
Hmm.
I inherit that trait from both my parents. My dad is a doctor, or he retired in 2019. But he was always very studious. He was the breadwinner of the family. My mom was a full-time mom of triplets, she's a superwoman. I don't know how she did it and stayed mostly level-headed throughout.
Hmm.
I mean, you know, raising three kids all at once.
Right.
Um, and we all had our different extracurriculars, and she'd have different hats and roles to play. She would wake up at 5:30 a.m. every morning to make us breakfast before school, make sure we were well fed, and then she would drive us to school. She never made us take the bus. She'd always drive us, and then after school, she would pick us up. She'd drive me to gymnastics practice, which was almost a 1 hour commute from
Hmm.
where I live, and she was very invested in me in particular. And I don't know if it's because I'm the only girl in a set of triplets, that mother-daughter relationship can be pretty intense sometimes. We're very close, my mother and I, but and I love her very much, and I know she loves me very much, but it's always tricky, when she's a little bit too involved sometimes and too emotionally invested in my outcomes and in my life and the decisions I make for myself. Um, but anyway, that's a little bit about my upbringing, I was over the summers we would go to China, because I'm American born Chinese. I have a lot of relatives overseas in China. And I would train gymnastics in China. And
Right.
as you could imagine, it was very intense, that kind of training. Kids there they all have the same dream, which is to make the Olympics. And
Hmm.
they have government-sponsored sports schools there.
Oh, wow.
Unlike America, where like all of your expenses, especially in a sport as niche as rhythmic gymnastics, or
Hmm.
even like figure skating as well, or like dancing, it all comes from out-of-pocket money, right?
Hmm.
But in China and also in Eastern Europe, like Russia, they have these government-funded sports schools where kids are hand-selected by talent recruiters from a very young age, like age 3, 4, 5. And then they go to these schools, they move away from their family, they live in these institutions, these schools, and they train. for we're talking like 6, 7, 8 hours a day, you know. And I would go there every summer to train with these Chinese gymnasts, and that was definitely the hardest thing I've gone through physically.
Hmm.
Like just the intensity, the sheer intensity of the training,
Right.
I'd be dripping in sweat. Like by the end of the day, we'd have practices twice a day. So we have our morning session, and then we'd take a 2 hour break to eat, take a nap, and then we'd come back in the evening for another 3, 4 hours. We were weighed twice a day, because in rhythmic gymnastics, like the quote unquote ideal body type for that sport is like a ballerina.
Hmm.
We value like the long lines, being thin, being sinewy. Um, so it was very intense, and
Yeah.
I was doing school alongside all that, and I think I really appreciate my mom for being so invested in our development as humans. She put a lot of weight in achievement, and excellence was not the gold standard. Excellence was the standard.
Hmm.
Excellence was expected.
Yeah.
So if we got an A- on a test, for instance, like she'd be like, "Why didn't you get an A?" You
Hmm.
know.
Right.
Um, it was the perfectionism also run very deeply. Gymnastics is a sport that demands perfection. There's a very
Yeah.
small margin of error.
Right.
Um, and, my mom is a huge perfectionist. So it was a lot of pressure. In short, my childhood was a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a very long-winded
Oh, it's
answer
okay.
to your question about growing up as a triplet. I would
Yeah.
say that, there was pressure from the outside,
Hmm.
because sometimes in high school, for instance, there was one class, multivariable calculus, where all three of us were in the same class with the same teacher in the same period, so how could people not look at us and be comparing the three of
Right.
us to one another?
Right.
So I felt that pressure both internally and externally, and I was always trying to outperform my brothers,
Hmm.
and that was my childhood.
So with that pressure and obviously within, whether it's Japanese culture, whether it's Chinese culture, mental health is, just something that isn't discussed, isn't talked about. So you talk
Yeah.
about pressure and your mom and you having that really good relationship, but there was those expectations. I'm
Yeah.
assuming there were feelings of being overwhelmed or feeling not up to par with what your mom's expectations, if you will, are. How did you approach situations like that where, I'm assuming burnout was a factor, just feeling overly exhausted and, just how did you cope with that pressure?
I myself am very type A and competitive, and I've always had a great work ethic. I was always
Hmm.
the way my therapist of 11 years described it, was like, Belicia, you are an unusually motivated girl, you know? I never felt like I was being forced to do anything, even though the pressure to be top of my class was a lot,
Hmm.
and in gymnastics, I wanted to be an Olympian, that was my dream. And um, my coaches would say, Belicia, you're the hardest worker in the gym. Like everyone, I was always kind of idolized as like the person with the best work ethic, So I think I didn't, I had a lot of pressure, but a lot of that was self-imposed pressure,
Hmm.
in addition to the pressures I faced externally, like from my mother, for instance. My
Right.
dad was actually chiller. He was a doctor and he worked hard in school. But he was a lot chiller in terms of like he just wanted us to try our best. He wasn't super involved as my mom was, um, in terms of our achievements. But yeah, I think how did I cope with the pressure? I just survivyou
Yeah.
know. That's all I could do. It was just like And I think one thing about being an athlete is you get in a set routine and every day kind of looks the same, you know, and you know what you have to do. You know, you wake up at 5:30, you train in the morning, you go to school. You don't have any friends because you don't have time for a social life. So at lunch times, you just do homework in the library, you quickly eat your food, and then you go to practice after school. And I'm here doing my homework in the car ride to practice, train for another 3, 4 hours. You know, practice ends at 9 p.m. Mom drives me home. I'm eating dinner in the car and finishing my homework, you know, in the car ride. And it's very structured, you
Yeah.
know, unusually structured for I think a child, you know, and an
Hmm.
adolescent.
Right.
Um, but I will say one thing about having that structure was it made things kind of psychologically easier, you know,
I
because
was going to
like
ask you about the structure part. Yeah.
I think structure is how I thrive. You
Hmm.
know, it's now I'm 27 and no one is going to tell you what to do at 27. It's all on you, right? How
Hmm.
you structure your day, how you plan out your time. And I look back on my past life as an athlete and I'm like, wow, you know, it was intense. It was hard. I was in a lot of physical pain a lot of the time. You know, I had injuries and mentally it was a lot of pressure. But, you know, I look back on that time with also fondness and a little bit of nostalgia because um, it was just simpler. You know, I
Hmm.
didn't have to think so much about like, okay, you know, today's a new day. What am I gonna do? You
Hmm.
know, it was all set in stone for me. You know, I
Right.
had very concrete goals that I was working towards. It was a very linear way of living, I'd say.
Yeah.
So, good and bad.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I feel like the structure part of your answer is something that's not talked about nearly enough for today's generation of kids, right? It's
Hmm.
technology based around everything, so it's hard to create that routine. It's hard to, I guess, put together a routine to where people are going to follow it because that attention span's not there. So I can only imagine
Exactly.
just as you're an adult now and you already have that foundation of a structure, how much easy, I don't want to say easier, how much more feasible it is for you to set your mind on something or set a goal on doing something and you already know what a structure looks like. So
Yeah,
creating a timeline, if you will, of what things that need to be done to hit that goal. So I think structure
absolutely.
is super important.
Absolutely. I attribute a lot of my, I guess, quote unquote, successes in
Hmm.
adulthood to my training as a competitive gymnast. You know, like I know how to set little goals that lead to bigger goals. I know how to, I have a good work ethic, and that was instilled in me from gymnastics and also from having a mom who was very, you know, intense with school and always pushing us. You
Hmm.
know, I have the work ethic. I know how to work hard. Um, but it's not just about working hard, right? It's about
Hmm.
working smart.
Right.
And another thing is like in sports, at least when I was competing, you know, back then mental health was really not part of the conversation. Not in sports and not in a sport like gymnastics, which is notoriously harsh and stems from this kind of Eastern European culture of
Hmm.
like, you know, you get yelled at by coaches. It doesn't matter. Everything's about the performance, you know, almost like discounting your humanity a little bit. You're just like a medal winning machine, you
Yeah.
know, your whole worth is based on your performance and how many gold medals you accrue. And, um, but it also was a gift. It was a great training
Hmm.
for me to know how, you know, now in adulthood, what I do is I do a lot of things. So my day job, I'm a yoga, Pilates, strength trainer, and professional dancer, instructor, and choreographer. So I'm just a movement artist. You know, I love moving. I love moving my body and I love being creative with the way I move. So after gymnastics ended, I was 15 when I got injured. So I had a knee injury and I had to stop my career, and it was very devastating.
Yeah.
And that was my very first experience with any kind of mental health crisis whatsoever, because
Yeah.
before that I was just like a machine, you know?
Hmm.
And then suddenly I lost gymnastics. I lost my identity. I didn't know who I was without the sport. And that was the first time I had to go to therapy because, no amount of like pushing through could get me out of that rut, of
Right.
like, I don't know who I am without
Hmm.
this sport.
Right.
And going back to the conversation about being a set of triplets, right? Like I mentioned, gymnastics was the way I distinguished myself from my two brothers. And then losing that distinguishing factor was really hard because now I'm like, how am I special? You
Hmm.
know?
Right.
So I had depression, I had anxiety, I lost all my confidence. I didn't want to talk to anyone at school anymore. Um, I was isolating, all those things. And then when I was about 16, that's when I decided, you know what? I need help.
Yeah.
And it was my decision to go to therapy. My parents didn't force me to go to therapy. I decided I need help. So
Right.
that's when I met Zoe, who was my therapist for from age 16 till basically now.
Yeah.
Um, and she was super helpful in helping me, learn the coping skills with depression, but also fundamentally like rebuilding my identity from scratch.
Hmm.
Um, Learning that, I am a full person. I am not just a gymnast. I am a
Hmm.
whole human being,
Right.
and also helping me grieve that whole chapter of my life,
Yeah.
because it was 10 years of just everything was gymnastics,
Right.
and then to lose that very suddenly, it was like very jarring, for
Yeah.
us for a 15-year-old to be able to process all of that. Um, and Zoe helped me through that grief process,
Hmm.
and through that process, I was like, okay, now like okay, gymnastics is over, but there are other things I can try. So
Yeah.
I then started exploring other sports. I knew I wanted to continue moving because I'm an athlete. So I was trying, like, I tried synchronized swimming, I tried springboard diving. I very quickly realized I don't like water sports. I want my feet on the ground. I tried other styles of dance like lyrical, contemporary. Those styles didn't really resonate with me. And then on Valentine's Day of 2015, how poetic, I had my very first private lesson in Latin ballroom dancing, and I fell in love, and I was just hooked. I was like, this is it.
Yeah.
Gymnastics was my part one of
Hmm.
my sports career. And
Yeah.
now I'm gonna take everything I learned in gymnastics, all that training in flexibility, coordination, strength, musicality, all that. I'm gonna
Hmm.
translate it. Now I'm learning a new language of movement in dance.
Right.
And little did I know that I would continue dancing and it would become my career. I didn't know that. All I knew in that moment was I loved it.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know where I was going with that, but I don't remember your original question. I am very
It's okay.
verbose and long-winded sometimes, but
It's okay. There's nothing
um
wrong with that.
yeah.
I think when we're doing things like this, when we're sharing our story, I think it's
Hmm.
important to share your heart. I don't like when things go robotic and we're just following a set of just like questions like, okay, how's this? Who's this? Why is this? You know what I
No,
mean?
exactly. And
Um,
that's how I run my podcast too. When I interview people, like I keep it loose,
yeah,
go with the
yeah,
flow of the conversation. So
yeah.
yeah.
Um, One thing I wanted to touch on really quick,
Hmm.
I'm glad that you said it, you brought up grief. And, that's something that so many of us, when we hear the word grief, we think of death. That's it. Like we don't think of the broader meaning of what grief is. Could be a
Hmm.
loss of a friend, could be a loss of a passion or a dream, like you said, could be a loss of a friendship. And I think I already said that. I'm sorry.
Hmm.
Um, But I think it's so important to acknowledge that grief is not just one thing. It doesn't just belong in one single definition. Um, Especially as we grow as adults and try to help the next generation and try to help the generation around us too, of trying to understand what grief actually looks like and what it feels like. You also mentioned, once gy- gymnastics was over, once that
Hmm.
dream is kind of essentially ripped away from you, you
Hmm.
lost your identity. Um, which kind of reminds me of, so I'm a big wrestling fan, right? I grew up
Hmm.
with wrestling, and there are a set of twins that are in wrestling right now. They're Jimmy and Jay Uso, right? And one of their story arcs was basically their cousin was trying to get them to break out, to stand out on their own, to stop getting the two mixed up with each other. Like, oh, I can't tell you guys apart because you're doing the same shit that he's doing. And
Hmm.
you had mentioned the comparison problem, right?
Yeah.
And when he was not essentially, because the character that's trying to influence him is also like a master manipulator, so it's a whole big thing with mental health. But point that I was making was I can only imagine being a twin or a triplet to somebody and being compared to that person all the time.
Yes.
My mom did that with me and my brother, even though we're 4 years
Mm.
apart.
Hmm.
And again, I'm glad that you found something that can not only give you that identity back, but just kind of set yourself aside from what your brothers do. And
Yeah.
I think it's so powerful that you were able to discover something that, I guess, that fast to recover from.
Yeah.
Um, when you started therapy, was that around the time that you were diagnosed with bipolar?
So the bipolar came later.
Okay.
My initial diagnosis was depression
Hmm.
and anxiety, and both generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder. Um, and a lot of that came from just an obliteration of my self-confidence. Whatever little self-confidence I had to begin with, I lost it all after losing gymnastics. And I had to basically retrain myself on how to talk to people. And I've always been very introverted. I still identify as an introvert, skewing towards introversion. I'm more of an ambivert now, I'd
Yeah.
say. Both. I have my introverted side, which is my predominant side, but I can also turn on the extroverted side when I'm, for example, performing in dance or teaching a class. But that extroversion, it had to come with training.
Hmm.
I am not naturally inclined to be up in front of people, and I had to grow accustomed to that. But that was my initial diagnosis. The bipolar diagnosis happened in 2018,
Hmm.
2018. I was 20 years old and I went to UCLA. So I was in the middle, it was the summer between my freshman and sophomore year at UCLA. Um, I was home for the summer. I went back to my child psychiatrist, right, who was treating me for depression and anxiety. And I was showing some symptoms of mania, right? Because bipolar, there's the highs and lows. There's the manic, which is just a lot of energy, a lot of like inflated sense of self-confidence. You're very talkative, your speech is really fast, you have grandiose thoughts, you have very, very high ambitions that are almost unrealistic and delusional. Um, you don't have to sleep as much, you know. Um, and those are some warning signs. Those are some symptoms of a bipolar manic episode. And hypomania is kind of a lesser version of that. It's mania, but a little bit less. So my child psychiatrist, I remember that appointment just like it was yesterday. I was telling her, yeah, I'm at UCLA, and I'll give you a little backstory. So I got into UCLA on scholarship, and I started as a pre-med student. Just like my dad, I was like, I'm gonna follow in my dad's footsteps. I'm gonna be a doctor. And also, I also want to continue dancing. I don't want to hang up my dance shoes just because I'm going to college. I'm gonna try both. I'm gonna do both at the same time. And not only am I going to try to do both, I want to do both really, really well. So my ambition going into college in 2016 was I'm going to be the world champion ballroom dancer. This is my goal. And I'm also going to be trying to get into the top med school, UCSF med school. That was my goal. And I'm going to graduate top of my class at UCLA, like 4.0 GPA. I'm going to graduate summa cum laude, and I'm going to do both at the same time, and it's all going to work out. Like, okay, so I always identified as a very ambitious person, but
Mm.
even that is it's a little extreme, wouldn't you say? It's kind of like being the best at like not just one thing, but two things, and at the same time. Um, that alone does not mean you're bipolar. That does not mean you're manic per se, but that in conjunction with other things such as the lack of sleep, like my freshman year at UCLA, like I barely slept, I was like sleep averaging like 3, 4 hours a night, I'd be pulling all-nighters just to not only to keep up my good grades, but I wanted to like get ahead in the course material.
Mm.
Okay, so I was pulling an all-nighter, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be like even better. I was like, I want to be like number one, so of course I'm gonna have to sacrifice sleep and pull an all-nighter to just study the chapters ahead of time. Um, and I was just very, very like intense, like I always was when I was a kid. But then there was also the fact that I transformed essentially overnight from like a very socially anxious high schooler to, oh my God, I'm suddenly in your face, like super confident. And it was like I flipped a switch and I'm like a different personality now. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not only confident, but I'm like intimidating to some people.
Mm.
I'm also doing a million things outside of school. I joined the student newspaper, I was dancing on dance teams, I was choreographing musicals, I was doing so much. And then I was telling my child psychiatrist this. I think her name was Dr. Hewitt. Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Hewitt. I was telling her about my freshman year at UCLA, and she was like, sounds like a little bit extreme. I'm worried about your lack of sleep. I'm a little worried that, something, something. I don't remember her exact words, but she diagnosed me with a mood disorder. She said she would keep it general. She wasn't going to put the bipolar label right then and there, but she said, I'm a little worried about it, so I'm going to put you on a mood stabilizer, lamotrigine or Lamictal. And so she loosely diagnosed me with bipolar type 2, which is cycling between hypomanic and depression. So it wasn't full-blown mania. Full-blown mania is bipolar type 1. It's the more extreme one, which I was later diagnosed with. But my initial diagnosis was just a general mood disorder. And yeah, and that was when I was about 20. So, um, I went back to UCLA sophomore year and I had this new diagnosis that I didn't know what to do with. I was just like, she's calling me bipolar. Like, I don't even know what the heck that is.
Right.
Like, I've
Right.
heard about it, but like, I don't know anything about it. And like, doesn't that just mean you're crazy? Like, you know how there's stigma attached to the bipolar label and
Any label for that matter.
any label.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think bipolar is one of the more stigmatized ones to this
Yeah.
day,
Yeah.
because we have media portraying bipolar people in kind of like a negative way, like we're
Yeah.
violent, we're unstable, we're crazy, we wreak havoc around
Mm-hmm.
those around us, and it's unhelpful. It is not helpful, because I know a lot of bipolar people who are managing it very well. And
Mm-hmm.
they are just like the rest of us. They're
Yeah.
not symptomatic. I call it that they're in remission. They're
Mm.
managing it so well that it's like it's not even there. But anyway, when I was diagnosed, I just ignored it. That's what I did. I just ignored it. I was like, you know what? Like, I'm just gonna do exactly what I did with the depression and anxiety. I am going to achieve my way out of it. I'm just gonna really throw myself into school and work hard and then everything will be better. It worked for the depression and anxiety. I committed myself to a new passion in dance. I worked really hard at it. It gave me a lot of confidence. I propelled myself out of the social anxiety by just, forcing myself to raise my hand in class or doing Toastmasters, the public speaking club. I was doing Toastmasters from age 16 just to overcome my shyness. And I was like, if I just work hard enough, then I won't have this, right? So
Hmm.
I kind of applied that same mentality with bipolar. I was like, okay, if I just really work hard at school and do something big, like graduate in 3 years instead of four, and that's what I set out to do, mainly because I wanted to prove that, like, well, if I can do something big like that, like, how can I be bipolar? Aren't bipolar people like just really messed up and dysfunctional and non-functional? So that's what I did. I ignored my diagnosis. I was on the Lamictal, the mood stabilizer, but it wasn't nearly enough to keep me stable. Like the rest of my college career was just very volatile.
Mm.
Whereas freshman year, I was mostly on a high. It was great. By the way, bipolar hypomania feels amazing. You feel on top of the world. You have so much confidence. You're like, I can do anything I set my mind to. You really truly believe that. Around people, you're just a social butterfly. In a way that's like you just don't have inhibitions. And it feels kind of like a drug,
Yeah.
being hypomanic. And that was all freshman year, and I made a lot of friends, and I was living my best life. And then sophomore year, though, was when it kind of took a dip. And suddenly I was getting into depressive cycles now. So now here's the cycling. It's starting, right? So now I'm not only high, but I'm also getting into the lows where there were days when I was so depressed. It was like I was a different person from yesterday. Now I don't have energy to even get out of my bed to go to class. I would push through the depression, and I think it was because I was an athlete. I know how to push through pain, but it was very hard, and going from like not needing to sleep at all to like sleeping 10, 11 hours a night. Going from someone who is super, super confident and bubbly and the life of the party to someone who just wanted to be alone and isolate. And it would happen just continuously, this cycle. Another thing I didn't mention before was like the impulsivity. That's another symptom of bipolar is the impulse control thing. For me, what that looked like was I started out college pre-med, and then I'd be on and off pre-med at least 10 times. I would always be like, one day I'm pre-med, I'm like, yes, I'm gonna do that. And then the next day I'm like, no, 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 no. I don't want to do pre-med anymore. I want to be a dancer. So then it would just constantly be flipping to the point where my dad even told me, he was like, it's kind of a joke, like how much you're flip-flopping between like what you want to do. It's like, are you pre-med or are you dance or what are you doing essentially? I was always operating from what I felt, my feelings in the moment, as opposed to logical thinking.
Mm.
I was a creature of impulse. One moment I would watch a YouTube video of a dancer and I'd be so inspired. I'd be like, no, 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 that's what I want to do. Okay, I want to be a dancer. And then the next minute I'd get scared and I'd be like, oh my God, but dance is such a scary path. It's unpredictable. It's art. You're not making a lot of money. Okay, I'm just gonna revert back to the safety of pre-med. And then I'd go, I'd be pre-med one day, dance another day. And looking back, that could have also been a sign of bipolar,
Hmm.
this constant flip-flopping. Yeah. So it's very volatile. College.
Yeah. Yeah.
Junior year, the year I graduated in 2019, it was even worse than
Yeah.
before. It just kept getting worse, because I wasn't going to therapy in college. I had a therapist when I was diagnosed with depression, anxiety, when I was a teenager, but then I was in Northern California. I'm from the Bay Area. And then when I moved to Southern California to UCLA, I was no longer eligible to see my NorCal therapist.
Mm.
And also, I turned 18 and she was in the child psychiatry department, Zoe. So I couldn't see her anymore. So I had to, ideally, I would have found a new therapist in college, that if there were any time to have a therapist, that would be then, because I'm not only dealing with bipolar, I'm just dealing with like college in general. There's so much
Yeah.
pressure, you know. But I didn't find a therapist, so I was essentially dealing with it all on my own. I still had a psychiatrist, but my psychiatrist in LA was just really like, I didn't know what the heck she was doing. She put me on Adderall my junior
Oh
year.
man.
It's
Everybody's
what I,
favorite to yeah.
I'm just like, what are you thinking? I'm a bipolar patient. Okay, I have tendencies to go high
Hmm.
already. And you're putting me on a stimulant that's just gonna make me go higher, you know?
Hmm.
And I'm just like looking back, and everyone I tell, they're like, "What the heck is she doing?" You know?
Hmm.
So she wasn't very helpful in that way, and um, I didn't have UC insurance, so they have the college health insurance that all of the college students were eligible for this. They call it UC SHIP. But because I was already insured through Kaiser and my dad was still working as a doctor through Kaiser, my dad was like, it doesn't make sense for you to be double insured, right? Why do you need the college insurance when you have Kaiser? Now, the thing
Hmm.
about Kaiser that a lot of people don't know is that their mental health services are notoriously shitty. It's just they tout their services as very group based. So a lot of emphasis on group therapy. But at the time, when I was trying to find a Kaiser therapist, they could only see me once every 6 weeks. That is
Oof.
not nearly enough if you're
Yeah, that's
trying to,
brutal.
especially navigating the early phases of a new diagnosis, you need to be seeing a therapist consistently to
Yeah.
make sense of all of it, to come up with a treatment plan. But
Hmm.
and the nearest Kaiser psychiatry office from campus was like a 40-minute Uber drive. And I didn't have a car in LA, and LA traffic sucks, So that really dampened my motivation to even go to appointments,
Right.
because I was so fixated on school and had
Hmm.
so much going on there. So I didn't have enough support, I think, in the early phases of bipolar, and I have to say the way I managed it was probably not very healthy.
Yeah.
I started getting into drinking. I call myself the sophomore gone wild. Freshman year, I was still very disciplined. I didn't really drink that much freshman year, but it was sophomore year when I started exploring this whole new world, right? I was like, "Ooh, alcohol. It's like it's fun." There was something about like, okay, when I'm hypomanic, I am the life of the party. I would go out partying a lot. But when I'm depressed, I'm just a social recluse. I'm a totally different person. Alcohol is this one thing that can help me maintain this image of
Yeah.
being the life of the party, because I was
Hmm.
so fixated on my image and my reputation, and I got a lot of recognition for my big personality, so to speak.
Hmm.
So when I would be feeling depressed, I'd be like, oh, I'm gonna be, everyone's gonna be like, what happened to her,
Hmm.
So no, I'm just gonna drink and I'll be happy again, at least in that
Yeah.
moment, I'll
Right.
be looser, I'll be freer, so that started my toxic relationship with alcohol.
Hmm.
Um, so that was one way I coped with it. When you're manic, it's really hard to sleep.
Hmm.
You just have so much energy. So alcohol is a depressant, so it would make me sleepy enough to go to bed. you know.
Right.
Um, but one healthy way of coping with it, I would say, was writing. I wrote so much, in those early days after the diagnosis. I had a blog. I've been blogging since I was 16. And I had this blog called Teenage Struggles. I started it when I was a teenager, so I called it Teenage Struggles. And I would be
Do you still
blogging.
journal?
I still journal and I still blog. Writing is like, honestly, I think I love writing more than I love dance. I, I love both for different reasons. They're both creative outlets
Hmm.
and ways for me to express myself. But I think writing in particular is something I've always naturally gravitated towards because I was always very shy as a kid. I didn't like to talk. But so the only way I could express myself was through writing. You
Yeah.
didn't have to speak. You have a voice, and you have stuff to say, so you write it down,
Hmm.
and that's where I found my power, what I didn't have the courage to say through spoken language, I wrote it down on pen and paper. And I would write, I think, probably the length of novels just to make sense of the chaos that was in my mind,
Yeah.
trying to stay sane. It was the lifeline that helped me grasp onto a semblance of reality, to stay connected to who I was. When
Hmm.
my mind was betraying me and turning against me, and I couldn't trust my brain like I did in the past, you know, how to make sense of that.
Yeah.
I would write about it, and I
Hmm.
wrote so much on that blog, Teenage Struggles, about my mental health challenges. So that's really, I think, what saved me, you
Yeah.
know, through the rest of college was writing.
So one thing as human beings that we all have in common with is loss, right? When I was
Hmm.
on your podcast, we had talked about the loss that I experienced and the loss that I experienced in October, this is the first friend of mine that I've lost to the way that he passed away. But for
Yeah.
yourself, I know you had experienced something similar in 2021 in terms of a loss.
Yeah.
And her name was Chelsea, right? Um,
Yes.
I know that was a big turning point in your life. How did that loss shape your commitment to mental health advocacy?
Yeah. So Chelsea Santos was my
Mhm.
dear friend from college. She also went to UCLA. She was also a psychology major, and she was the girlfriend at the time. She was the girlfriend of my friend, and that's how I got to know her. And we connected, and even after they broke up, like we still remained friends. And I just remember, you know, she was very introverted and shy, just like me, my natural self. I'm very introverted, and around her, I didn't feel like I had to perform in any way. I could just be my shy, introverted self, and she would accept me, and we bonded over our shared mental health challenges. She had gone through depression, anxiety, just like me. And in her, I found someone I could confide in as well about my mental health challenges that some of my other friends, I didn't feel like they could get it, but she got it, you know? And I remember we graduated together. In 2019, we were at the graduation ceremony sitting right next to each other, and we took a selfie and it was super fun, and we had the whole world ahead of us, like we were UCLA graduates and we had big dreams. And I think after graduation, the next time I saw her after that was, I mean, COVID happened, right, in 2020. So she's also a Bay Area native. So, I moved back to the Bay after college. She moved back to the Bay. So we reconnected in, I think it was 2021, and I remember her driving to Redwood City where I'm at. At the time, I had a fear of driving. I didn't want to drive. And she also had a fear of driving too. When we were in college, that was another bonding point. We both hated driving. We were so scared of it. But the fact that she was able to drive from Fremont to Redwood City to see me and driving on the freeway, I was like, damn girl, like how'd you get over your fear? And she's like, oh, I just did it, because my dad has diabetes and I've had to take more of a role in, going out, doing groceries to help him out. So it was just exposure therapy. The more you do it, the less scared you are. And I was very inspired by her. I was like, if Chelsea can overcome her fear of driving, like I can too, you know? Um, and then I remember in April 2021, the two of us went to the Van Gogh exhibit in San Francisco. This is Vincent van Gogh. He was a tortured artist, and he also had bipolar disorder. After his death, he was posthumously diagnosed with bipolar, some say schizophrenia. But World Bipolar Day every year is his birthday, March 30th. So going to this exhibit in SF, where it was like in this warehouse, it was just in honor of all his beautiful artwork. We would sit there, the montage would play for like 15, 20 minutes, all the pictures of his creations on the screen, total immersion, right? With beautiful music playing in the background. And we sat there, the two of us. We went there together and it held this added layer of significance for us because we knew that Vincent van Gogh is kind of like us. He also struggled with similar demons. And I just remember that day, um, it was the last time I saw her alive, and I didn't know it would be the last time, you know. Um, and I sat through one run through of the montage and then I had to go because I had like a family lunch planned or something. So I had to like very quickly say goodbye to her. I was like, "Bye, girl, I'll talk to you later. I have to run." I didn't know how much longer she sat there by herself in that building. But looking back, I was like, we could have used like a debrief session after that, something that had so much significance to us and could have been triggering too, because Vincent van Gogh also ended his own life, right? And I just think, I wonder, it haunts me to this day. I wonder if something like she was thinking, kind of romanticizing suicide a little bit when it was put in conjunction with the beautiful artwork and creations he created. It was like this tortured artist archetype just coming to the fore in this environment, in this exhibit, kind of romanticizing, this is a man who struggled with very similar things that Belicia and I are struggling with, that I currently am struggling with. So she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder after me. So I was diagnosed in 2018. She was diagnosed, she first told me about it when I reconnected with her after graduation in 2021. She said, I also have the bipolar diagnosis. So in those early days, for her, it was the early days. She was really struggling, very similar challenges that we all go through upon receiving a diagnosis like that is like figuring out the medication, finding a therapist, coming up with a treatment plan. She was really struggling with that, and I was something of a mentor to her. I tried to be a mentor to her. I was trying to give her advice on things that helped me. Um, Now at the time I wasn't stable though. I
Yeah.
was I was still going through my depressive phase. I was not nearly as stable as I am now. I didn't have the tools I have now. So I could only help her so much, I
Yeah.
think. And um so I was sitting in my therapist's office on, I think it was May 1st, 2021. I was sitting in the waiting room of my therapist's office when I was scrolling through Instagram and I followed her sister on Instagram. So I was clicking through her sister's Instagram story and it was like a collage of pictures of her and Chelsea when they were like little girls. And it was just picture after picture. I was like, oh, those are really cute. Like how precious. And the last picture it said, I will miss you, sis. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? Okay. And then the final picture was a screenshot of the GoFundMe page for the funeral. It was like, and I was like, funeral? What? Like, that can't be right because I was just talking to Chelsea last week on the phone and we were planning to go to our first rave together, Excision. We were excited about it. They were playing locally and we even bought tickets. So I was like, "Wait, how is this possible?" Like I was on the phone with her a week ago and she sounded excited about this rave that we are going to and she sounded happy. So I was like, "Holy shit." And then when I realized, I was like, "Wait, Chelsea is gone. She's she's dead." Then I just stood up from my seat and then I sat back down. I stood back up. I was like, what the fuck? What the fuck? And then my therapist walks in now to the waiting room and I just tell Zoe, I was like, oh my God, Zoe, I think Chelsea just ended her life. I think that's what happened. Because I couldn't think of any other reason, you know? I was like, I knew she was going through mental health stuff. I knew she was going through bipolar. She was really struggling. And we spent that whole session, I don't even remember it. I was just like, I was going into the session ready to bitch and complain about my mom. Okay, and then suddenly this happens. So now I'm just sitting there in a state of shock. And it was just, oh my God, to say it was devastating is an understatement.
Yeah.
To lose anyone to suicide, like a friend, a loved one, a family member, to lose anyone to anything is tragic enough. But when you lose a loved one to suicide, it's difficult because you wonder if you could have done more to make them stay and to make them not have made that decision, to end it. And I had a lot of survivor's guilt too. I was like, why do I get to live and Chelsea had to go? She was 24. She had the whole world ahead of her. She was in a master's program training for her therapist license. She was going to be a therapist. And it's just like you wonder if you could have done more.
Yeah.
And I really beat myself up over that for a
Mhm.
very long time. I was like, why did I not take her cries for help more seriously? She's texting me all these concerning things, and I'm just like, I could have done something more.
Yeah.
Why couldn't I have just gotten over my fear of driving for just a second and drove to her house in Fremont just to check up on her, see if she's okay? Or at the very least, maybe, I was friends with her sister on Instagram, maybe like text her sister, be like, hey, check up on your sister. I don't think she's doing very well right now. Why couldn't I have done that at the very least? I feel like um, if only I could talk to her right now in the state I am in now, at 27, having been stable for a while now, having the psychoeducation and the tools and everything. Um, I feel like right now, I would be much better equipped
Yeah.
to help her,
Yeah.
but, and I don't want to make an excuse at all
Yeah.
for
No, no,
myself.
I
I'm
don't feel
not.
you're not making an excuse.
It's just that is so tragic because it's
It
like you
is.
can't take that back, when
Yeah.
someone dies by suicide, it's like they say it's like a permanent solution to a temporary problem,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And I went to her funeral, it was an open casket funeral.
Oh,
Those are the worst. I mean, it's like you see their body, but they're not moving. And,
yeah.
anyway, I don't want to get too graphic into it,
It's
but I
okay.
just
Yeah.
don't remember the last time I cried that hard,
Yeah.
and like there was like a montage of all the pictures from her life playing. And I just remember seeing the picture of me and Chelsea on graduation day. And it was right there. And it broke my heart.
Yeah.
I was like,
Um,
yeah. Hmm.
I uh I wish this would be such a normalized conversation of how the people that are on the other end of people who have taken their life. You know, when Brian passed,
Hmm.
I just remember the first couple weeks of just I could have done more. I could have done more,
Yep.
and like you said, beat yourself up for a while, right? And one of the hardest things for me is I wish more than anything Facebook didn't do this. Um, it told me the date that he left the group, and it was 6 days before he took his life. And I I verbally talked so much shit about myself for weeks because we do what we do. We have the conversations that we have to the magnitude of these kind of conversations. And when your passion is mental health and you pride yourself on being an advocate for mental health, and then
Hmm.
somebody passes away or takes their life for mental health crisis, it feels like I'm not going to say we're doing this for nothing because that is not true. That is bad thoughts telling you a lie. But it's like I'm not doing enough. I'm
Hmm.
not spreading the word. I'm not having the conversation nearly enough, even though I talk about it every day,
Yeah.
you know? And I remember his ex-wife reached out to me and she saw one of my videos on TikTok and she reached out to me and she's like, "Hey, I just, I wanted to reach out to you because Brian's ex-wife and I know, he had a lot of problems with me and we had our differences and everything and I just wanted you to know that I'm here for you if you want to talk." And the first thing that she did, we exchanged numbers and she sent me a really nice photo of him and his son. And I went against my better judgment and, she sent me the autopsy report. And in hindsight, maybe I shouldn't have read it, but I told my therapist and said it was a closure for my heart because I hate wondering why. I hate wondering how because my
Yeah.
brain is just always so hyper focused on that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I want to take this negative energy and I want to flip it before we go too far down this rabbit hole. If somebody is feeling suicidal or is having a mental health crisis and you're the friend that is trying to help them, what's the best advice you would give to that friend?
I would just say stay. Choose to stay. What you're going through right now is, I could only imagine how hard it is. And, but this too shall pass. You know that quote, this too shall pass. It's a cliche, but I think it's true. Especially with bipolar, it's like a cyclical illness. You have highs and lows, right? So for every low you have, it doesn't last forever, you
Hmm.
know? You're gonna bounce back at some point. And just make sure you're not going too far high. But,
Yeah,
it's like it's a cycle. We all go through these cycles in life, The bad times are so, so hard and they may push you to the brink where
yeah,
to the point where you feel like you have no way out.
yeah,
No way out. But just know that there is always a way out, you know?
absolutely.
God is taking care of you.
Yeah,
I'm a spiritual person. And just knowing that, trusting in a higher power when you feel like you don't have the strength at all to take on the world, to live,
yeah,
I pray in those moments, you know. I pray to God to give me the strength to fight for one more day,
yeah,
you know. And I turn to support from loved ones, people I trust, you know, to give me the strength I don't have. And
yeah,
that speaks to a couple things, right? The power of social support, having loved ones who care for you. Um, I truly believe that if I didn't have a single loved one in this world, if my family was not so supportive of me, if I didn't have close friends who were supportive, I probably would have I probably would not be here, today. But, when you do have people in your life who love you and you love them, then I think that alone is a protective factor because the one thing that stopped me from ending it in my lowest points was just this knowledge, like I cannot do that to the people I love. That's what kept me here.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to say like put any blame on the people who take their life. Not that at all. It's I just wish I could give them a hug and
Yeah.
say it sucks right now. It's like horrible, horrible, horrible. Like I can't even begin to imagine the pain you're going through right now, but I'm here. I'm gonna sit with you for as long as you need. I'm gonna give you a hug. I'm gonna let you know that you are valued, that I appreciate you in life, in this life. I want you here. And and there is a way out of it. You just have
Yeah.
to take it, if not day by day, moment by moment,
Absolutely.
1 second at a time, however brutal it may be. And just also know like you're not alone because
Hmm.
mental health, like everyone goes through their own version of mental health challenges to varying degrees of severity, of course. But we were not meant to weather life's storms alone.
Yeah.
We're social beings. We got to learn how to lean on other people for support.
Right.
And that's why, Chris, I am so impressed and grateful that you have the mental health community that you've built,
Thank you.
because that is a source of support for people who may not have friends and family in their immediate circle who are supportive of
Yeah.
them. They
I
turn
appreciate you.
pages like forums, groups like yours. They listen to this podcast to get that support, and it's such a resource for people struggling out there.
Yeah.
So, what you're doing matters so much,
Same
and
thing for you. Same thing for you.
yeah, and going back to that topic of advocacy, right? Like
Hmm.
before Chelsea died, I always identified as a mental health advocate, you
Hmm.
know. Um, I was always passionate about it, given my own lived experience with mental health challenges, but after she died, it kind of lit a flame in me. I was like, you know what? I am never gonna lose another loved one to suicide if I can help it. I will do
Yeah.
everything in my power
Hmm.
to keep my loved ones safe and here, So after that, I started writing a memoir about my journey with bipolar disorder. And I've been working on this memoir since 2022. Still in the works, but this memoir is dedicated to Chelsea, dedicated to her. It's in
I
her
hope to
honor.
read it someday.
Yes. No, once I publish it, I will try to spread it to the world,
And
because
I'll
it's,
help you do this. I'll help you do that too. Of
thanks, Chris. Thank you. I appreciate
course.
that.
Yeah.
And my podcast right now, The Well Anchored Life, it's also in her honor,
Yeah.
talking about mental health, interviewing people who have gone through mental health challenges and, kind of picking their brains on how they overcame it, sharing with the listeners what are some actionable things they can do in their own lives to feel better, to
You know
overcome
what's
hard things.
what's funny about that is your podcast is dedicated to Chelsea and my podcast is dedicated to Santi. He
Yeah,
helped me find my voice, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
Chelsea lit that flame under you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it speaks to how passionate we are as advocates and people when we're pushed hard enough, when we have suffered hard enough that we do everything in our power to try and enlighten people, to try and lift each other up. And
Yeah,
you don't realize how much good that we're doing till you meet that person that reaffirms like, holy shit, you're more emotionally intelligent than you look. I've had people, say, I'm really surprised at how well that like your thought process is on some of these topics. And I don't even realize it. It's just like kind of like a second nature to me whenever we have these kind of conversations. And it's like my whole thought process is if you're not passionate about something, you shouldn't be doing it. If you don't
Oh,
love doing this, you
totally.
shouldn't be doing it.
Totally. I totally agree. Yeah. Um, I will say that, the emotional intelligence, the capacity for empathy, um, the desire to help, these are all silver linings that come as a byproduct of suffering, I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
Bipolar was the hand I was dealt. That was my suffering. That was my challenge. And it was Chelsea's challenge also. Um, and there's a term called post-traumatic growth.
Hmm.
So we have trauma, right? A lot of people have trauma of all sorts, for whatever, it could be mental health, it could be, abusive relationships, abusive parents, it could be any kind of trauma, and it's not the trauma that defines you, it's how you react to it and how you grow from it. And there's a phenomenon in psychology called post-traumatic growth, where you grow as a human after this adverse experience. It sucks, it's hard. You could either let it consume you, or you could grow from it and learn some lessons. And I don't want to mitigate or diminish how difficult trauma is, you know, but two people can experience the same traumatic event and react very differently, right? And have very different outcomes. So, and I feel like, Chris, you are one of those people because you were on my podcast and you told me all about the trauma you experienced growing up. And, from your parents, from your mom, from, mental health, all of that. But you're a survivor, you know, and I love this quote from Robin Roberts, make your mess your message. You took all that adversity and you channeled it into a mission that drives what you do now to this day.
Yeah.
With this podcast, with your advocacy work, you made your mess your message. And I feel like I'm doing a very similar thing as well, you know?
Absolutely.
Um, so I think bipolar was challenging and it caused a lot of suffering, and I lost a lot of friends because of it, and I did a lot of embarrassing things and things I regret, but I wouldn't trade it for the world because I would not be the human I am today
Yeah,
without bipolar,
yeah,
like the first 18 years of my life, I was just a goal achieving machine. I was just all about work, achievements, sports, I was just like my whole worth is based on how many accolades I accrue and accumulate, but that was a very one-dimensional way of living. It was very selfish. It was very driven by ego. It was just I was like half a human.
yeah,
But then bipolar happened and it fucking humbled me.
yeah.
I was like, you know what? Like bipolar taught me that I am a human.
Hmm.
I have emotions. I happen to have very big emotions, and I'm imperfect, and that's okay. Um, and it forced me to learn how to lean on other people for support, because before that I was like, I don't need people in life, I'm fine by myself, I was like a lone wolf. But now I'm like, no, I actually really do need people in my life to keep me going, and it made me feel, yeah, like this kind of empathy towards people who suffer, any kind of suffering. It doesn't have to be bipolar, it could be anything,
Yeah,
you know. So I think the bipolar ultimately, now I can say this because I have done the work on myself to learn how to manage it. Um, Now I'm on the other side of it. I will say bipolar was a gift to me.
yeah. I feel like one of the most powerful quotes that I've ever heard was the getting the gift of darkness is one of the greatest gifts that I've ever gotten in my life. And you know what? For as much shit as I've had to endure and for the kind of people I was forced to grow up with to call my parents, I learned what not to be, how not to be, how not to treat people. And it made me into the person that I am today, on top of the losses, on top of the attempts. It made me into the person that I am. And
Yeah.
sometimes you don't feel comfortable talking about your story because, we're in this weird culture of comparison. We're in this weird culture of your trauma's not as bad as my trauma kind of mentality,
Mm.
you know.
Hmm.
Um, but I think it's important to acknowledge that we're all playing the same game. We're
Yeah.
all just on different levels of this game. And it's
Yeah.
it's rough. It's the roughest game in the world, and it's called life,
Yeah.
you know?
Totally. Hmm.
Um, But to that, before we get to the quote to close out the podcast,
Hmm.
where can our listeners find you?
Yeah. So my podcast is called The Well Anchored Life, and it's on Spotify and YouTube. And I just wrapped up season one, so I'm taking a little hiatus. And season two is going to be coming in. I don't really know when. I'm thinking maybe a few months from now. But
Awesome.
you can find me on Instagram. You can follow my personal, Belicia.Tang. I also have my business, Venture True Wellness, which is an online holistic health and wellness platform. So that's Venture True Wellness. I mean, I honestly, I run 5 different Instagram accounts right now. I have so many different businesses, probably because I'm bipolar and I have all these ideas of like the expansiveness of thought. I can't just do one thing. I have to do
Yeah,
like 10 million things. But yeah, I'm on Instagram, and you can find my website, venturetruewellness.com. And thanks, Chris, for having me on the podcast. It was such an honor.
yeah. Thank you for coming on. I think you're an incredible human being, and I
Thank
will
you.
forever remind you that every chance I get. And I'm
Thank you.
grateful to have been on your podcast and grateful to have had you on my podcast. Um, Before I read my quote, do you have any closing words you want to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, first of all, Chris, your podcast episode, if you guys haven't checked it out, it's on my podcast, The Well Anchored Life. I interviewed Chris, and you should check it out because Chris, your story was so, oh my God, like I've gotten feedback from other people who listen to it, and they're just like, man, this guy went through so much, and he's such a survivor. You're a survivor and you didn't let your hardships define you. You didn't let it make you into a bitter, resentful person. Instead, you're using your challenges that you went through to help other people going through similar things. And you're such a hero in that way, you
Thank
know?
you.
Um, so thank you for being on my podcast. And I guess the last thing I'll say is like, you know, life is unfair. You cannot control your circumstances for the most part. You cannot control the challenges you're faced with. That's all circumstantial. And what you can control is how you react, though. I always remind myself, like, I have agency. I don't have agency over everything, but I still have agency. I still have power on, you know, how I can handle this situation, you know? Even though it feels like everything's coming at you all at once and there's so many uncontrollable factors out there. I want to encourage and challenge people to remind themselves that no, you still have control.
Yeah.
They say, I think this quote from Viktor Frankl, he was a Holocaust survivor and he was a psychologist. And he said, choice is the last of the human freedoms. It's the choice on how you respond to your adversity. You could either sink or swim, you know? Um, you can only control one person in this life, and that is yourself, you
Absolutely
know?
agreed.
And I think I truly believe this. I think maybe it's also growing up as an athlete, we were always taught the lesson of accountability, showing up to practice, like motivation, like bipolar was the ultimate challenge that I
Hmm.
faced. Harder than gymnastics, far harder than any kind of like brutal physical athletic training I was subjected to. the emotional verbal abuse from my coaches, like all of that paled in comparison to the bipolar disorder. But I truly believe like being an athlete, a competitive athlete, gave me the skills to
Yeah,
be able to tackle the greatest challenge yet, which
right.
is bipolar. And my biggest accomplishment, I think, in my whole life is overcoming bipolar disorder and learning how to accept myself in spite of, and maybe even because of the bipolar, you
Yeah,
know? Um, they say God gives us challenges that he knows we can handle. He wouldn't give it to you otherwise.
right.
I want to leave listeners with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said. Um, so today's quote comes from Jameis Kiseo, and it reads, resilience is all about being able to overcome the unexpected. The goal of resilience isn't to just survive, but to thrive. I found
I
that
love
and I'm
it.
like, this is perfect for both you and I. I just couldn't find any quote that was better than that one. So, um,
Totally. Yeah.
glad I found it. Um, but again, Belicia, thank you so very much for coming on the podcast. Maybe we'll have a part two somewhere down the line if you're interested. Um,
Absolutely.
we can
Yeah.
dig a little bit more into your story, and maybe the time that your memoir rolls out, we can do the second episode.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know when
Um,
that will be. I'm
yeah, no
hoping I'll
pressure.
have the I'm still chipping away at that. It's been
Yeah,
a labor of love, but definitely would love to be on a second time. And thank you, Chris, again for the opportunity to
yeah,
share my story. And I
of
hope that
course.
this can be inspiring to whoever's listening.
I have no doubt that the people will be inspired. So thank you, Belicia, and thank you as always to our listeners for tuning in. Until next time, be gentle with yourselves and much love.